The night was already dying when the car stopped in front of the mansion. No music, no voices. Just the low hum of an engine fading into silence, and the cold air of Alhambra pressing against the windows. The house stood still on the hill, massive, distant, almost watching. Inside that limousine, something had already changed. Hours earlier, everything looked ordinary. Lights, laughter, movement. The kind of night that disappears without consequence. Inside the House of Blues, people came and went like they always did. Music filled the air. Drinks were poured. Conversations blurred into noise. That's where she was. Lana Clarkson. Working, smiling when necessary. Surrounded by strangers who would forget her by morning. And somewhere in that crowd, there was a man who never blended in. Phil Spector. Even in silence, he carried something heavier than presence. Something controlled, calculated. They spoke. No one paid attention. Because nothing about that moment seemed important. Not yet. Not when she agreed to leave with him. Not when they stepped outside. Not even when the limousine door closed behind them. The city kept moving. Traffic lights changed. People laughed in the distance. Another night in Los Angeles continued like nothing mattered. But inside that car, heading toward a place few people ever truly knew, the story had already begun to collapse into something else. The driver would later remember the silence. Too quiet, too controlled. Like something was being held back. Minutes passed. Streets emptied. The city slowly disappeared behind them until there was nothing left but darkness and that house waiting at the top of the hill. The gates opened. The car moved forward. And then it stopped. They stepped out, walked inside. The door closed behind them. The driver stayed where he was, waiting. Time stretched. No sound, no movement. Until sometime later the door opened again. And what came out of that house was not the same night that went in. Because in just a few moments, something inside that mansion would turn permanent. Something violent, something irreversible. And when the silence finally broke, it would not be music. The door closed and the world outside disappeared. Inside the mansion, everything felt different. The air was heavier, still, almost untouched, like time moved slower in that place, or refused to move at all. The house was known as a castle, and it looked like one. Tall ceilings, long corridors, shadows stretching across the walls as if they had something to hide. It was not the kind of place that welcomed people, it absorbed them. Lana Clarkson stepped inside without knowing that every second from that moment on would matter. That every glance, every silence, every shift in tone would slowly build toward something irreversible. Behind her, Phil Spector moved with familiarity. This was his domain, a place where he controlled everything. The environment, the pace, the atmosphere. And control was something he never let go of. At first, nothing seemed out of place. A conversation. A drink. Fragments of a normal interaction trying to exist inside a space that did not feel normal at all. But tension doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly. Something in the room began to shift. It could have been a tone of voice. A look held just a second too long. An answer that didn't match the question. Moments that on their own meant nothing, but together created a pressure that couldn't be ignored. Because for him, this wasn't just another conversation. And for her, something started to feel wrong. What investigators would later piece together suggested a pattern, one that had happened before. Women who found themselves alone with him. Women who tried to leave. Women who were stopped. The night was no longer casual. It was narrowing, closing in. The distance between staying and leaving had become something fragile, something dangerous. And somewhere In that silence, a line was crossed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but definitively. Because control, when challenged, doesn't always retreat. Sometimes it escalates. What happened next would not be seen. There were no cameras inside that room. No witnesses standing between them. Only the walls. Only the silence. And a moment that would end with a single violent interruption. A sound that would shatter everything that came before it. And the seconds after, nothing would ever be the same again. Because inside that mansion, in the early hours of that morning, one person would walk out alive. And the other would never leave that room. There are moments that divide a night into two parts. Before and after. Inside that mansion, the silence had been building for too long. Pressurized, unstable, waiting for something to break it. And then it did. A single gunshot. Sharp, close, final. Not the kind of sound that echoes for long, but the kind that changes everything instantly. In that room, the aftermath was immediate. Lana Clarkson was no longer standing, no longer moving. Her body collapsed into a chair, motionless, as if the life had been removed in a single violent second. The wound was devastating. A shot fired inside her mouth. Teeth shattered, scattered across the floor like fragments of something that could never be put back together. There was no struggle left. No second chance. Just silence returning, heavier than before. Outside, the driver waited. Adriano de Souza had been sitting in the car just as he was told. Engine off, eyes occasionally drifting toward the house. Minutes passing with no indication of what was happening inside. Until the door opened and everything changed. Phil Spector stepped out into the night. But he wasn't the same man who had walked in. In his hand, a gun. His movements were different, unsteady, disconnected, as if reality hadn't fully caught up with what had just happened. And then he said something that would echo far beyond that driveway. "I think I killed someone." Not shouted, not panicked, almost distant, like a realization arriving too late. Those words would become one of the most chilling elements of the entire case, not just because of what they meant, but because of how they were said. Inside the house, the scene remained frozen in time. A room that had, minutes earlier, held conversation and movement, now held only evidence, a body, a weapon, and the irreversible truth of what had just taken place. But even in that moment, the story was not as simple as it seemed, because when investigators would later examine the weapon, something unexpected would raise questions. There were no clear fingerprints linking it directly to him. No simple, clean narrative waiting to be accepted. Instead, what followed would become something far more complicated. A battle of interpretations, of intentions, of what truly happened inside that room. Because while the outcome was undeniable, the explanation behind it was about to be fiercely contested. By the time authorities arrived, the house was no longer just a mansion. It was a crime scene. Flashing lights painted the exterior in red and blue, cutting through the stillness of the early morning. The same silence that had once surrounded the property was now filled with movement, but inside, nothing had changed. The room remained exactly as it had been left, frozen. Lana Clarkson sat lifeless in the chair, her body positioned in a way that investigators would study again and again. Every detail mattered now, every angle, every fragment scattered across the floor. There were no witnesses to guide them, only the evidence. And the evidence was unsettling. The gunshot wound was unlike anything accidental. The trajectory, the proximity, the violence of the impact, it told a story that did not align easily with chance. Nearby, the weapon, a revolver, silent now, but holding answers, or perhaps more questions. Because when they examined it closely, something didn't make sense. There were no clear fingerprints from Phil Spector on the gun. For a moment, that absence created doubt, a gap in the narrative, something the defense would later hold on to with force. But investigators knew something else. A lack of evidence is not the same as innocence, especially in a room where only two people had been present. Outside, the statements began. The driver, Adriano de Souza. His account would quickly become one of the most important pieces of the case. He described the waiting, the silence, the moment the door opened, and those words, "I think I killed someone." Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. But even that would not be enough to make the case straightforward, because as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered something far more disturbing than a single night. A pattern. Stories from other women began to surface. Encounters that did not end in death, but carried the same tension, the same fear, the same presence of a weapon. Moments where control turned into intimidation, where leaving became difficult, where a gun was used not to fire, but to dominate. Individually, each story was unsettling. Together, they painted something far darker, a behavior that repeated itself, a line that'd been approached before, but never crossed like this. Until now, and as the pieces came together, one question began to take shape. Was this a tragic accident, or the inevitable end of something that had been building for years? Because what happened in that room was no longer just about a single moment. It was about everything that led up to it, and everything that would now come after. Long before that night, there were warnings, not loud enough to stop anything, not strong enough to change the outcome. But they were there, buried in memories, in stories told quietly, in moments that, at the time, seemed isolated, but now began to connect. As investigators pushed deeper, a pattern started to take shape around Phil Spector. It wasn't about music anymore. It was about control. Women who had crossed his path began to describe something disturbingly similar. Encounters that started with charm and slowly shifted into tension. Nights that felt normal at first until they weren't. In each case, there was a turning point. A moment when something changed in him. Rejection, disagreement, distance. And then the weapon appeared. Not fired, not always used, but shown, pointed. Enough to transform the entire atmosphere. Enough to replace conversation with fear. Some described it as sudden, others as calculated. But all of them agreed on one thing. The gun was never random. It was control made visible, a way to stop someone from leaving, a way to hold power in its most literal form. Individually, these stories could be dismissed, misunderstood, questioned, but together they form something much harder to ignore. A repetition, a behavior that didn't belong to a single night, but to a pattern that had been quietly unfolding over time. The prosecution would later call it a common scheme, not coincidence, not misinterpretation. A method, but the defense fought back hard, because bringing these women into the case meant changing everything. It meant shifting the focus from one moment to an entire history. And the law doesn't easily allow that. Past actions are not supposed to define a present accusation. But this wasn't just about the past. It was about intent. Was what happened to Lana Clarkson truly an accident or the final step in a pattern that had been escalating for years? That question would divide opinions inside the courtroom, across the media, and among those who followed the case closely. Because if the past was allowed to speak, it would say something very clear. This almost happened before, more than once. And this time, it didn't stop. The case did not explode overnight. It built slowly, quietly, like pressure behind a sealed door. Months turned into years, and yet the question remained untouched by time. What really happened inside that room? While the world waited, Phil Spector was not behind bars. He was free, released on a bail set at $1 million, moving through life under the weight of something that had not yet been decided. To some, it felt unreal. A man at the center of a death, still walking outside. But the trial was coming, and when it finally began, it did not happen in silence. It became a spectacle. Cameras were allowed inside the courtroom. Every movement, every expression, every word observed, analyzed, broadcast. What had once been confined to a mansion in the early hours of the morning was now unfolding in front of the entire world. At the center of it all, he sat, still controlled, watching everything. The prosecution began to build its narrative piece by piece, not just the night, not just the shot, but the pattern, the behavior, the tension that had surfaced long before that morning. They argued this was no accident. This was control taken too far. This was anger triggered by rejection. This was a man who had done this before, and this time it ended differently. But the defense responded just as aggressively. They dismantled every assumption, questioned every interpretation, challenged the idea that the past could define the present. And then came the most critical argument. What if it wasn't murder? What if it was something else entirely? A mistake. A tragic accident. A moment where everything went wrong in a way no one intended. Because the absence of fingerprints on the weapon created doubts, and doubt was everything. Inside that courtroom, truth was no longer a single version of events. It became a battlefield. Experts were called, forensic details examined under a microscope, each side trying to control the narrative the same way he once controlled sound inside a studio. And just like in his music, every detail mattered. But unlike music, the story would not end in harmony. Because as the trial moved forward, something unexpected began to happen. Not in the evidence, not in the arguments, but in the people responsible for deciding it all. The jury. They were listening, watching, absorbing everything, and slowly they were dividing, because the more they heard, the less certain everything became. And that uncertainty was about to change the course of the entire case. In a courtroom, silence can mean many things. Attention, tension, doubt. And as the trial moved forward, doubt began to spread quietly, like something no one could fully control. The jury listened to everything, every testimony, every expert, every reconstruction of what might have happened inside that room. They saw the photographs. They heard the words. I think I killed someone. And still, it wasn't enough to make the truth unanimous. Because the more the case unfolded, the more complex it became. On one side, the prosecution insisted on a clear narrative. Phil Spector had a history, a pattern, a need for control that escalated when challenged. That night, they argued, was no different except for the outcome. On the other side, the defense held on to uncertainty, like it was the only thing that mattered. no fingerprints, no witnesses inside the room, and a possibility, however small, that what happened was not intentional, that it was an accident. Inside the jury room, these two realities collided. Some saw a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Others saw gaps that could not be filled. And when people see the same evidence but reach different conclusions, something begins to fracture. Days passed. Deliberations stretched on. The pressure grew heavier with each passing hour, because this was not just about deciding guilt, it was about certainty. And certainty was slipping away. In the end, the division became undeniable. 10 jurors believed he was guilty. 2 were not convinced. That was all it took. No verdict. No closure. Just a system that could not reach agreement. The judge had no choice. A mistrial was declared. Everything that had been built, all the arguments, all the tension, all the expectation, collapsed into uncertainty once again. For the public, it was shocking. For the prosecution, it was unfinished. And for Lana Clarkson, it meant that what happened inside that room still did not have a final answer in the eyes of the law. But this was not the end, because some cases refused to stay unresolved. And this one was coming back, stronger, more focused, and with far less room for doubt. The next trial would not just revisit the same story, it would sharpen it. And this time, the outcome would not remain divided. Some cases fade after a mistrial. This one didn't. It returned heavier, sharper, more deliberate. When the second trial began, everything felt different. There were no cameras this time, no public spectacle unfolding in real time. The noise had been stripped away. What remained was something colder, more focused. Inside that courtroom, the objective was no longer just to present a story. It was to finish it. Phil Spector entered once again, but the atmosphere around him had changed. The uncertainty that once surrounded the case had now turned into pressure, the kind that builds when something unfinished demands resolution. The prosecution adjusted its approach. They didn't just present evidence. They refined it, removed distractions, strengthened connections, focused on what mattered most. The pattern, the control, the moment that turned fatal, everything pointed toward a single conclusion. This was not an accident. And this time, they made sure the jury would feel that weight more clearly than before. The defense, however, did not retreat. They stood on the same ground, but fought harder, questioning every interpretation, every assumption, every attempt to turn behavior into intent. Because if there was still doubt, even the smallest fragment, it could change everything. Inside the courtroom, the tension was different now. Less chaotic, more precise. Every word carried intention. Every pause had meaning. There was no room left for confusion, only for decision. The jury listened again. But this was not the same group, not the same minds, not the same interpretations. And as the days passed, something became clear. This time, the division was not as strong. The arguments landed differently. The narrative felt tighter. The pieces connected with less resistance. The silence inside the jury room returned. But this silence was not uncertain. It was building toward something final. Because after everything that had happened, after years of questions, arguments, and delays, the case had reached the point where it could no longer remain unresolved. A decision was coming. And when it arrived, it would not leave space for disagreement. 19 days. That's how long the jury stayed behind closed doors. 19 days of silence, of analysis, of revisiting every detail that had been laid out in that courtroom, every word spoken, every image shown, every doubt raised, and every doubt challenged. Inside that room, the story was no longer being told. It was being decided. When they finally returned, the atmosphere shifted instantly. There is a specific kind of silence that exists just before a verdict is read. It is not empty. It is heavy. Every person in that courtroom felt it, the weight of years compressed into a single moment. Phil Spector sat still, watching, waiting. No expression that revealed what he was thinking, no movement that broke the tension. Across from him, the final answer was about to be spoken. The jury had reached a decision. Not divided, not uncertain. This time, they agreed guilty. Second-degree murder. The words landed with finality. No hesitation, no ambiguity. After everything, the law had reached its conclusion. And in that instant, the case changed forever. What had once been a question was now a conviction. What had once been debated was now defined. But the verdict did not stand alone. There was more. The jury also found that he had used a firearm in the commission of the crime, a detail that would not just reinforce the decision, but extend the consequences that followed. Inside the courtroom, reactions were controlled, but the impact was undeniable. For some, it was justice. For others, it was the end of a long uncertainty. And for Lana Clarkson, it was the moment where the system finally acknowledged what had happened inside that room. But even then, it wasn't over, because a verdict is not the end. It is the beginning of what comes after. Sentencing, consequence, and the reality of what it means to live with a decision that cannot be reversed. The man who once controlled sound was now about to lose control of everything else. A verdict defines guilt, but sentencing defines reality. Weeks after the decision, the courtroom filled once again. This time, there would be no arguments about what happened, no reconstruction of that night, no competing narratives fighting for space. The part was over. Now, the question was simpler and far heavier. What should the rest of his life look like? Phil Spector stood before the court no longer as a defendant, but as a convicted man. The distance between those two things is invisible, but absolute. There was no performance left, no strategy to reshape perception, just the weight of what had already been decided. The sentence came down with precision. 19 years to life. Not a number that passes quickly, not a sentence that fades into time. It is a structure, a future defined by limitation, by walls, by years that do not move freely. There was an addition. 4 more years for the use of a firearm, a detail that reinforced the severity of what had happened inside that room. And just like that, it was final. The man who once shaped sound inside recording studios, who built layers of music that echoed across generations, was now entering a world defined by silence of a different kind. No crowds, no control, no escape from routine. The shift was absolute. From influence to confinement, from creation to consequence. Inside that courtroom, the transformation was complete. For the justice system, the case had reached its conclusion. The timeline that began in the early hours of a February morning in 2003 had now arrived at a fixed point. But outside, the conversation continued. Debates about intent, about evidence, about whether everything had truly been understood. because some cases never fully settle in the public mind. They leave questions behind. And even when the law speaks clearly, people still listen for something else, something unresolved, something that doesn't fit perfectly into a verdict. But for him, none of that would change what came next. The doors would close, and the rest of his life would unfold behind them. A life that once felt limitless, now measured in years that could not be taken back. There is a moment when power disappears completely. Not gradually, not symbolically, but absolutely. For Phil Spector, that moment did not happen in the courtroom. It happened after, when the doors closed behind him and did not open again. Inside prison, identity changes, not because of what you did, but because of what you no longer are. There were no studios there, no artists, no control over sound, space, or people. The man who once directed every note with precision now lived in a place where nothing responded to him. Time became something else, not a tool, not a schedule, a weight. Days repeated themselves with a cold mechanical rhythm. Wake up, move, wait, return, sleep, and then again and again and again. No variation, no escape. And in that repetition, something begins to happen. The past gets louder, because when there is nothing new, everything old returns. The mansion, the silence, the shot. That moment does not fade. It sharpens. Outside, the world still remembered the name, the legacy, the music that once defined an era. But inside, none of that had value. Fame does not exist there. Influence does not exist there. Only consequence. There were attempts to fight it, appeals filed, arguments raised, claims that something in the process had been wrong. But each attempt met the same response. Denied. Again. And again, the system had already decided. And it was not listening anymore. As the years passed, something else became visible. Time was not just moving forward. It was taking something with it. His health began to decline, slowly at first, then more noticeably. Age, isolation, and confinement working together in silence, the same way pressure had once built inside that mansion years before. There was no audience for this part. No cameras, no headlines. Just a man and the consequences that followed him into a place where nothing else remained. Because in the end, control was the one thing he could never lose. And also, the one thing he would never get back. Time does not announce the end. It approaches quietly, unnoticed at first, until there is nothing left to continue. Years had passed since that night, years since the verdict, years inside a system that does not change, does not slow down, does not forget. For Phil Spector, the world had already narrowed to something small, a routine, a space, a reality defined by limits that would never expand again. And then, something else arrived. Not sudden, not dramatic, but inevitable. Illness began to spread beyond control. A virus that had already reached far beyond prison walls. A presence that did not care about history, fame, or consequence. COVID-19. Inside a correctional health facility, the margin between stability and decline is thin. And once that line is crossed, it rarely returns. His condition worsened, gradually, then completely. There were no crowds watching, no cameras documenting the final moments. The man who once stood at the center of attention would reach the end in isolation, surrounded not by sound but by silence. On January 16th, 2021, it ended. No announcement can fully capture what that means, because death does not resolve a story. It only stops it. The sentence remained unfinished. He would have been eligible for parole years later. But time made that irrelevant. And just like that, one of the most complex and disturbing cases involving a figure of influence came to a close. But not completely. Because while the man was gone, the story remained. The music still existed. The legacy still echoed. And so did the night that changed everything. The contrast became permanent. On one side, the architect of sound, a man whose work shaped generations, whose creations filled spaces with emotion and depth. On the other, a single moment of violence that redefined how the world would remember him. Two identities, impossible to separate, forever connected. And somewhere between them, a silence that no music could ever cover again. Some names never return to what they once were. They change, permanently, not erased, but rewritten. After the death of Phil Spector, there was no final resolution in the way people expect. No clean separation between who he was and what he did. Instead, both remained connected, unavoidable, because his legacy was never simple. Long before that night, his work had already shaped the sound of an entire era. Songs that filled radios, defined emotions, and became part of people's lives without them ever knowing who stood behind them. Studios once revolved around him. Artists trusted his vision, his methods, his ability to transform something ordinary into something unforgettable. That part of the story did not disappear. It couldn't. The music still exists. The influence still echoes. But now it carries something else with it. A shadow. Because every time his name is mentioned, it no longer belongs to just one narrative. It splits into two realities that cannot be separated. The creator and the convicted killer. For some, the work remains untouched, something independent, something that should be judged on its own. For others, that separation is impossible, because knowing what happened changes how everything is heard. Every song, every production, every moment of brilliance now exists alongside a single, irreversible act, and that tension never resolves. The case of Lana Clarkson ensured that it never would, because her name is now permanently tied to us, not through music, but through silence. A silence created in a room where no audience existed, where no one could intervene, where everything ended in a way that could never be undone. And that is what remains. Not just a crime, not just a career, but the collision between them. A reminder that a person can build something extraordinary and still be remembered for something else entirely. Something final. Something that rewrites everything that came before. Some stories don't end when the person is gone. They linger in questions that were never fully answered, in moments that can never be replayed, in silence that still feels unfinished. The case left behind more than a conviction. It left fragments. Inside that mansion, there were no cameras, no recording of the final minutes, no definitive version of what was said or what was felt before everything changed. Only interpretations, only evidence trying to speak for a moment that no one else witnessed. And because of that, something always remains uncertain. Was there a point where it could have stopped? A second where the outcome could have been different? Those questions don't belong to the court anymore. They belong to the space between what is known and what will never be known. For Lana Clarkson, What remains is not just the way her life ended, but the way it was taken from her in a place where she should have been safe. A moment that erased everything that could have come after. For Phil Spector, what remains is a legacy permanently divided, a name that can never return to a single meaning. And for everyone else, what remains is the story. A story that forces a confrontation with something uncomfortable. The talent does not prevent darkness. That influence does not guarantee control. That a single moment can outweigh an entire lifetime. Because in the end, this was never just about a crime. It was about contrast. The highest level of creative brilliance, existing alongside something deeply destructive. And the realization that both can exist in the same person, that truth is what makes this story stay. What makes it difficult to forget? Because it refuses to fit into something simple. There's no clean conclusion, no version that feels complete. Only the weight of what happened and the understanding that some nights never truly end. They just stop, leaving everything else behind. In the end, what remains is not the moment. It is the echo of it. Long after the night is over, long after the headlines fade, long after the people involved are gone, something continues. Not visibly, not loudly, but permanently. The story of Phil Spector does not settle into a single identity. It never will, because it was never just one thing. It was brilliance and something far darker. A man who once built sound with precision, now remembered for a silence that cannot be undone. And somewhere within that contrast, there is a discomfort that never fully disappears. Because people want clarity. They want to separate, to define, to decide what something means and leave it there. But this story refuses that. Every note he ever produced still exists. Every song still plays. The influence is still there, moving through generations that may not even recognize its origin. And yet, so is that night, still present, still attached, impossible to remove. The name Lana Clarkson ensures that it never fades into abstraction, that it never becomes just history. Because her story is not an echo. It is the center of everything that followed. A life that ended in a moment that should never have happened, but did. And that truth anchors everything else. Even now, years later, the case continues to exist in that space between memory and meaning. Not as something active, but as something unresolved in how it is felt. Because resolution is not the same as closure. The court reached a verdict. The sentence was carried out. Time moved forward. But the weight of it stayed. And maybe that is what defines this story more than anything else. Not just what happened, but how it refuses to disappear. Like a sound that never fully fades. Like something still vibrating beneath the surface long after everything else has gone quiet. Because some stories don't end, they echo.